Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Okay, this week, after I wrapped up the Isaiah podcast, I really struggled to find a message for this Shabbat. Those of you who watch sporting events are familiar with certain commercials where someone is trying to decide where to place their sports bet. They can't make up their mind. The commercial goes something like this. The person sits on the couch, and the lamp behind him turns into the same person, and he shouts out the name of a sports team. The person opens a kitchen drawer, and inside the drawer is himself, who shouts out the name of another sports team. But my favorite is a guy sitting on the couch, watching TV, eating a big bucket of popcorn. Suddenly, in the bucket is his own head, spouting out the name of a sports team. Then the head munches on the popcorn surrounding his head. Now, the whole idea is that these great gambling hunches are all around you, and you have to listen to the hunches. Of course, the Ruach of Elohim works quite differently. Well, that was me on Tuesday night, and Wednesday morning. I prayed and I heard in the back of my mind, talk about the brothers. Okay, so I go to sleep. I pray in the morning and ask Adonai to tell me what he wants me to talk about. Then I go and get coffee. And by chance, I'm looking at my email, and there, once again, is an email about Jacob and Esau. So I watch a brief video on how Jacob tricked Esau out of his blessing. I say to myself, everybody talks about that. That sermon has been beaten into the ground. Then I do some extra work. I work on a website and I pray some more. Then I reach out to a friend for prayer. Almost immediately after the person replied, they will pray for me, I clearly heard the words idiomia or idumia, which would be more accurate, idumia. Now, idumia means red, and Idumea is also the name of the land dominated by the descendants of Jacob's twin brother. If you remember back a few weeks ago, we talked about the troubled pregnancy of Rivka, Isaac's wife. At that time, Adonai revealed that two nations were in her womb. We all know the story of Jacob and Esau. We all know that Jacob sought to obtain his brother's birthright and blessing from their father. This week's reading, now 20 years later, after Esau threatened to kill his brother, the two confront face to face. 400 armed men rode with Esau to meet Jacob, who plodded along with his wives and children, servants, and many cattle. Jacob presented his brother with gifts and bowed down 7 times before his brother, as we heard, and the two reconciled. Beautiful story. End of the story? No. In fact, that encounter was the beginning of a struggle still taking place today. In fact, it's an epic struggle that plays out in the Holy Scriptures, but many of us have missed the players because the names changed. And what's more, we missed the whole story behind the events that we know very little about. I will do my best to fill in the gaps for everyone. But to do that, I need to go back to the aftermath of the stolen blessing. After Jacob's deception, Esau begged for a blessing. Isaac panicked. He didn't know what to do. And in that moment, Isaac received a prophecy of his eldest son. You will live by your sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck. Genesis 27, verse 40. What Isaac gave was indeed a prophecy. It's a look into Esau's future, and more than that, into Esau's descendants. Esau had to move after the reconciliation with Jacob. Jacob's wealth and possessions overwhelmed the land, so Esau moved and became a separate nation. Edomites, or Idumeans, lived southwest of the Dead Sea, or at least they used to live southwest of the Dead Sea, with the capital in Bozrah. Hundreds of years later, when the children of Israel, now a massive nation, came triumphantly out of Egypt, they tried to pass through Edom's land, but they ran into a brick wall. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that came on us. Permit us to pass through your territory. He answered, you may not pass through. So Edom came out to oppose Israel with well-armed men. Once again, brother met brother, with well-armed men on one side and the children of Israel, women, children, and cattle on the other side. Since Edom refused to permit Israel to cross through her territory, Israel turned away from them. We see that in Numbers 20, 14 through 21. The Idumeans remained a thorn in the side of Israel for centuries. And in the time of David, they were finally subdued. In all of history, Esau has aligned with anybody who challenged Israel. Can there be any wonder why Edom is chosen as an example in prophecy when it comes to the nations of the rest of the world? Well, our brothers Edom, aka the Idumeans, celebrated when Babylon carried off the people of Judah into captivity. So what did they do? They strolled right into Judah and they set up residence, and a large settlement migrated into the Hebron area. The songwriter of Psalm 137 was clearly in the time of Jeremiah, because he sings, remember Adonai, the children of Edom, what they said on the day Jerusalem fell. Strip her to her very foundation. You read that in Psalms 137, verse 7. The conduct of Edom angered Adonai, and he sent his message to Ezekiel at that time, even though he was in captivity in Babylon. Thus says Adonai Elohim, because Edom has taken severe vengeance against the house of Judah and has grievously offended by taking revenge upon them, therefore says Adonai Elohim, I will stretch out my hand upon Edom. I will cut off man and beast from it. I will make it desolate. From Taman to Dedan, they will fall by the sword. I will take my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. They will do in Edom according to my anger and according to my fury. They will know my vengeance. It is a declaration of Adonai. Ezekiel 25, verses 12 through 14. One of the last writing prophets, Malachi, recorded Adonai's disgust with Esau's descendants 100 years after the book of after the writings of Ezekiel. In Malachi chapter 1, verse 1, we read, an oracle, the word of Adonai to Israel by Malachi. I loved you, says Adonai. But you say, how have you loved us? Was Esau not Jacob's brother? It is the declaration of Adonai. Yet I loved Jacob, and Esau I hated. I made his hills a wasteland and gave his inheritance to the jackals of the wilderness. For Edom may say, we have been beaten down, but we will return and rebuild the ruins. Thus Adonai Sevaot says, they will rebuild, but I will tear down. They will be called a wicked territory, the people Adonai denounced forever. Malachi 1. One of the attributes of Adonai is that he is slow to anger. He doesn't always act when we think he should. So the Idumeans thrived after Persia. They grew and became indistinguishable from the Jews. They lived together, they intermarried, they became Jewish-like. It looked like, to many of us, that Edom had disappeared. To the Greeks and Romans, there was no knowledge of Esau and Edom, only Jews and Idumeans. And the Idumeans seemed Jewish or Jewish-like. If you look at Bible maps in the time of Yeshua, you will notice that the south of Judea is Idumea. Idumeans became the cosmopolitan upper class of Judea. They enjoyed Greco-Roman lifestyles and they thrived in the cities. Their engineers and builders began building magnificent palaces and estates all over the Middle East. One of the architects we all know by name. The platform he constructed to support the temple is visible from space today. And this is when the nations warring in Rivka's tomb turn even more ugly and directly challenge Adonai's plan of redemption for all of humanity. Just remember, yet I loved Jacob and Esau I hated. We don't often say this in this way, but I'm going to anyway. Yeshua of Nazareth is a son of David, and David is a son of Jacob, and as such, inherits the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was planned that way from the beginning, and I mean literally from the beginning. It's no wonder that the Magi, who came from a long Jewish tradition established by Daniel and Ezekiel from Babylon, it's no wonder they came to Judea because they knew a king was about to be born in Bethlehem, as the scriptures have foretold. Not just any king, a descendant of King David, one destined to inherit the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just as Isaiah prophesied, and who would bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. But guess who's occupying the throne of Judea in the days of Yeshua's birth? An Idumean, a client state of the Roman Empire, ruled by the descendant of Esau, by the name of King Herod. What an incredible turn of events. Esau is ruling over the house of Jacob. Remember, two nations at war from the womb. One child struck out his arm first, and the midwives tied a red thread on his wrist. Remember Jacob told Esau? Remember what Jacob told Esau after he begged his father for a blessing? Let me remind you. You will live by your sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you break loose, you will shake off his yoke from your neck. Let's go over them. Esau and Edom always confront Jacob with armed men. Since the time of David, Jacob has repeatedly suppressed Edom. And then came the sword of the Romans. With the mighty sword of the Roman Empire, King Herod's family ruled Judah for 40 years. Really, for over 40 years. Now, the war against Jacob becomes even more personal. King Herod knew enough about the Holy Scriptures to take the arrival of the Jewish Magi from Babylon very seriously. They had come to anoint a king. When he was tricked and they took off in the middle of the night, he decided the best way to secure his dynasty was to eliminate any future competition. He had all the newborn baby boys and all of Judea massacred. But the son of Jacob, Yeshua, escaped to Egypt. Later, when the new King Herod became threatened by a prophet operating in the spirit of Elijah, Herod had that rabbi imprisoned. We know the fate of Rabbi Yohanan the Immerser. The battle between the house of Jacob and the house of Esau would now come down to the courts. Rabbi Yeshua, loved by the masses, was secretly arrested, tried, and convicted in a series of overnight trials. At last, Yeshua was brought before Pilate on Passover. Virtually, the entire house of Jacob, all of the religious Jews, were preparing for the Passover. They were completely unaware that Rabbi Yeshua was being tried and executed. So, who were the Jews not preparing for the Passover and gathered at the palace of Pilate? I'll give you a hint. They were mostly a Jewish-like people, a people who were Jewish, but who lived among and married with the Jewish people. If you study the people of the time period, you'll see that Idumeans adhered to Greco-Roman culture and lifestyle completely. They did not keep the practices of the religious people, and they took pride in being Greco-Roman by their own admission. Even though the chief priests were instigating the crowd, this crowd of Idumeans, the non-religious Jews, they were in the middle of the crowd and the people preparing for the Passover. When Pilate asked, should he execute their king? Keep in mind, the priests were there instigating the crowd. This crowd replied to Pilate, listen to these words, we have no king but Caesar. These secular cosmopolitan Jews, not preparing to observe the Passover, were from the house of Esau, Idumeans. A Jewish person in Judea at that time had only one king, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the king of Israel. The religious people of Israel would never have said, Caesar is the king of Israel. Once again, remember Jacob told Esau, but when you break loose, you will shake off his yoke off your neck. Maharaj said this earlier, and it's true. When we bless our children, we bless their children and their children's children. The same is true of curses. Let's summarize the house of Esau so far. Number one, they caused the children of Israel to bypass their lands in Edom on the way to the promised land. Number two, they participated in wars against Israel until David subdued them. Number three, they engaged with Babylon to celebrate and defeat the kingdom of Judah. And number four, they took up residence in Judah in large numbers and adapted the identity of the Jews. I want to remind you of something that happened in John. Can you remember how Yeshua argued with the people who said, our father is Abraham? And Yeshua refuted them? Why didn't they say, our father was Jacob? Because he wasn't. Look at that account in John 8 with different eyes this time. Number five, Edom seized power with the might of Rome and ruled over Judah for decades. Number six, a son of Esau created a genocide of all the boy babies, trying to eliminate Yeshua, the Messiah. Number seven, a son of Esau prisoned and beheaded Rabbi Yochanan, the Immerser. And number eight, the children of Esau participated in the trial and crucifixion of Yeshua as King Herod, and later as members of a mob outside the palace of Pilate on the day of Passover. I just named some of the major battles between the house of Jacob and the house of Esau. There is so much more. Josephus, in his work, The Wars of the Jews, records that Idumeans worked with the Zealots to seize the temple in Jerusalem. To help them purge the house, the chief priest demanded Rome retake the temple. The Romans, tired of all this fighting, responded by retaking the temple and destroying Jerusalem and the nation of Judea in 70 CE. They took Jews prisoners and marched them to Rome along with the vessels of the Holy Temple. But listen, they freed and allowed some 50,000 Idumean men to remain in Judea, and they renamed the territory Palestine. There is an extensive library of Jewish literature from the early modern era on the battle between Jacob and Esau. All of those stories were written long after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. But one thing is certain from those Jewish traditional writings is that Edom, the name Edom, became a code word for Rome and later for the Christian church. With the rise of Muhammad, years later, the Idumeans were converted to Islam, while the Jews in Palestine remained faithful to the faith of the patriarchs. Idumeans became known as just one of the native Palestinian Arabs living in former Judea. When the rest of the Arab world unified to throw off the yoke of the Ottoman Turks, one Arab group remained defiant and separate, claiming ancestral connection to Judea, renamed by the Romans to Palestine. Where was the house of Jacob after the Crusades and after the defeat of the Ottoman Turks? Well, they were there, right there in Judea. But the Arabs had several names for the Jewish people living in Judea at the time, now called Palestine. They called them Abnas al-Balad, which translates to sons of the country. Or they called them Yahud Alad, Arab, which translates to Jews, sons of Arabs. The funny thing is, in modern Arabic, Yahud Alad also means Jewish children. In the 20th century, in 1919, these native Arabs, anciently called Idumeans, or the house of Esau, who remained in Judea after the fall of the temple, began to develop a separate identity, and they became opposed to Zionism, opposed to the return of the remnant of the house of Jacob. So listen, just as Esau met Jacob with armed men, just as Edom refused passage to the children of Israel coming from Egypt, just as the Idumeans seized and occupied Judea with the help of Rome and planned a genocide to kill the Messiah while he was barely able to breastfeed, so Israel is today battling to keep the land of promise that was given to them from of old. These separatist Arabs who claimed Palestine created their own distinctive flag in 1916, fashioned after the flags of other Arab states. Yet, strangely, the other Arab nations refused to support the new Palestinian Arab people. I don't have to speak about all the revolts and explosions between the Idumean descendants and their Arab neighbors, nor will you learn about these events in the news media or even in school for that matter. But this I know, that battle between the houses of Jacob and Esau is at the root of the conflict in Israel today. Jacob had told Esau, but when you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck. The world cannot understand because they have forgotten their ancestors. And most of us can barely remember what happened last year. Lastly, the world is distant from the Father's message. We go to churches and shuls, and we prefer to hear messages of personal prosperity and feeling good. Yeshua gave explicit instructions to the house of Jacob. Let me quote Matthew 24. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch becomes tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the door. Amen, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That's in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35. What's happening in our streets? I'm sorry, one moment. This is what happens when you don't get a lot of sleep at night. So, what is happening in our streets at this time, right now, is that in the nations of Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and to some extent the Arab nations, an ancient war foretold to Rivka, Jacob, and the whole house of Jacob, all of their descendants, is being played out. But there is a coming resolution to this centuries-old battle between the twins, Jacob and Esau. It's recorded in obscure ancient text, rarely read, written in 570 CE, shortly after Judah was carried away captive into Babylon. Remember when I began, I was struggling to find what Adonai wanted me to share with you this week? It turns out I was being a little hard-headed and I was not listening. Adonai had given me the answer before I even asked. Last Saturday night, when I started collecting scriptures and notes for Tuesday's class, before I had read the Parashah this week, I had the answer. Because if I had read the Parashah for this week, I would have noticed the reading for this week holds what I'm about to say to you now. The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph, while the house of Esau will be straw. They will set them on fire and consume them, so there will be no survivors of the house of Esau, for Adonai has spoken. The victorious will go up on Mount Zion to judge the hill country of Esau. Then the kingdom shall be Adonai's. That comes from Obadiah, the Haftorah for this week. It was about the brothers all along. Since 1897, the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland, it was declared that Zionists seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine under public law. And on November 2nd, 1917, Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, conveyed the following pledge in a public letter. His Majesty's government's view with favor the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. To quote a famous Zionist leader from 1917, his name is Chaim Weizmann, he said, at first, the camel sticks one leg into the tent, and eventually, it slips in. This epic battle playing in our sight is a warning by our Rabbi, Messiah Yeshua. Pay attention to the parable of the fig tree, because it points to the coming kingdom coming to this earth. And it will happen at the resolution of the conflict between the two brothers. Shabbat Shalom.
Amen. Amen.